Only 10 minutes last.
Thank you, Claire. Look, you're very welcome, Mr. Shanahan and your team, and well done on your clear audit accounts, as others have said, and on the fantastic job that the IDA does in bringing jobs to Ireland. And I want to commend you on the work that has been done by our team over the course of the last number of years. Just if I can start first with Connect Ireland, just a very quick question. To start maybe with your own organisation first, how much is the cost of an IDA created job? Would you do a calculation on when there's jobs created, how much per job does it cost?
Okay, so the calculation for the cost of job is done on a 7-year moving average based on sustained jobs over that period.
Yeah, the amount I'm looking for, not the methodology.
And the cost is 9,148.
And is there a comparable cost then for a Connect Ireland created job?
No, because of the way the methodology doesn't allow for that, because A, there hasn't been 7 years of Connect Ireland experience.
But is there a different methodology? Are you certain that there is, that they themselves have not published figures, or they themselves have not produced a cost?
I have seen some comparison drawn, Deputy, between the 9,148 and the 4,000 that we pay to Connect Ireland as a fee. But I would point out that's an additional fee.
Who makes that comparison? Sorry, who's making the comparison?
So I've seen that comparison. I think
by who? But you've seen it. But who made it?
Connect Ireland, I suspect.
Connect Ireland themselves. It's their figures.
Yes.
Okay. And do they get paid only when they create a job?
Correct. When there's a job on the ground. Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to be clear on that first. In relation to the actual figures then, when I think you said in your opening statement that 19,000 jobs were created in 2016
yes.
by IDA companies, would that be correct?
Correct, yes.
How is that calculated in the first instance, and then how is it proven that that's actually the case, that there is actually 19,000 jobs created?
So there is, it's carried out independently of IDA, as it is for other agencies, by our parent department, who do a census of all of the companies within our portfolio. So they literally go and ask the companies what they have created, and they verify that they have been created.
How do they verify them? That's the point I'm asking.
Through engagement with the company.
So it's solely based on information coming from the company. It's not based on anything else. So if the company says there's 50 jobs, they just take that as 50 jobs. There's no other verification.
Yeah, I think there is further, particularly where there are a large number of jobs created, there are meetings and like direct engagement with the company to understand what the jobs look like, what categories they're in, and so on. Yes.
And I ask it because, and it's every time there's an announcement, it's always a nice even figure of 100 jobs or 200 jobs, and then we want to know, well, exactly how many jobs were created. So are we just taking these round figures and we add them all up, or is it that we actually have the real figure of what is actually created?
The latter, because so when we announce jobs, that's what the company's ambition is and what they're hoping to do, and they're telling the world what they're hoping to do. But the only figure we use, and the figures I provided to you today, are the figures for jobs on the ground as a result of a census undertaken by our parent department.
But the figures come from the companies themselves. So yes, you take at face value what the companies say.
Yeah, they fill out a detailed form.
I understand that.
Yes.
It's more the information comes from the companies.
Yeah, I think there is also subsequent checking on some of those.
Could you provide us maybe with some background information on how that's done?
Yes, delighted.
That's perfect. The other issues in relation to and regional development has been raised, and I can't let you go without raising issues in the South East. As you can imagine, it's one of the two areas it is problematic, although I do acknowledge that jobs have been created in recent years. We had a much bigger problem 5 years ago. We're in a better place, but it's still a problem and it's still a difficulty. So I'm looking at the national figure of 6.4%, and I'm looking at a figure for the South East of 8.1%. And even within that, there are variations where there are some parts of the South East where unemployment is even higher again. And I'm constantly trying to figure out, Mr. Shanahan, why that's the case. Because I talk to stakeholders and opinion makers and entrepreneurs and captains of industry in the South East, and they all say the same thing. There's no good reason why the South East has a higher unemployment rate, and yet it has. So I'm trying to figure out then, well, why and what are the solutions? And it's very important because resources and infrastructure follows jobs. So I'm a great believer in we need to bring jobs to Ireland Inc. I know that's your primary function. A lot of jobs come to Dublin. We have to build up the capital city. The problem is if it overheats, it creates pressures in relation to public transport, housing, rent pressures and all the rest of it. So we do need a counterbalance and we have to identify where the areas are. But I'm trying to figure out, well, why is the South East, why has it got an unemployment rate much higher than the rest of the state? Is it skills shortages? Is it property solutions? Is it infrastructure? What is it? The hard analysis must have been done by your organisation. So if you could just help me first on that and help me understand why the South East is underperforming to the extent that it is. And I'm not at all dismissing the good work that's been done. So I know you're going to come back and say, well, we've increased jobs. I accept all of that. I'm talking about the reality of the here and now, where the unemployment rate is higher than the national figure. Yeah. Can you help me as to why that's the case? Yeah.
So, Deputy, I won't go through the long list of FDI, particularly in your in your own county. And I suppose you did acknowledge, to be fair, that is growing. And I think that's the positive for me, in the sense of, because the more of a cluster we can build, the more that comes in. Okay, so we've had some really strong announcements, particularly in Waterford. And I acknowledge you're asking about the region. I'll come back to that. But that is the starting point. That is how you build out a cluster in the first instance. But it is okay. It is, I suppose, the attractiveness of the region relative to the other options that companies have. And so we have to continue to improve across all of the issues that you've mentioned, whether it is infrastructure, trying to get a bigger existing base, availability of skills, all of those things, but relative to everybody else. So, and I don't mean relative to other regions in Ireland, I mean relative to everybody else.
But help me out by being specific here, please, Mr. Shanahan. So when you said earlier, and I was taken by it, I think taxation is important. I think it's one of the factors, but I actually agree with you completely that skills and I think talent, you said the availability of talent was the key ingredient, and that makes sense for companies. Is that a problem then in the South East? Is that what it is? We don't have a university, for example. So what's the joined up thinking? Because very often we hear departments operating in silos. So what's the joined up thinking in terms of you're looking at this, you're looking at the unemployment figures, you're going out, you're meeting companies, they have to make decisions around where they locate. We obviously need to build up our capital city. We do all of that, but then there needs to be support for other regions. So if the key ingredient is availability of talent, is that then a problem in the areas where unemployment is higher?
Yes, I think is the answer. And you can probably see this to some extent in the South East, that where we have an Institute of Technology, Waterford, we have achieved more investment into there, and there has been more indigenous growth as well, and obviously IDA isn't the only arm of the state involved in industrial development. You can see the benefit of having it. Whether it is an Institute of Technology or a university, in my view, it is not important. It is obviously university has more cachet, I think, than Institute of Technology. It is what that institute does is what's most important, to be honest with you. But you can see where you have it. You can see a cluster emerging. In practical terms, things we have done ourselves include putting a property solution on the ground, which we thankfully were able to sell to a pharma company very quickly, creating jobs. We're now about to do the same again. That's how you start to build a cluster, and then you move out from there. And I think there are other counties in the South East that have opportunities. I was down in Gorey on Monday addressing a financial services seminar, some very strong players there around which we would have ambition to build a cluster. That is how one does it. And then all of the things that you mentioned, we need to continually improve on, not just in the South East region, but across Ireland, because we are competing with everybody else.
And two final questions, because I know other people want to come in. How important is it that there's a chiming, I suppose, and a connectivity between your overall investment strategy and the national planning framework, a new national planning framework? How influential, how important will be the view of IDA in relation to a new national planning framework? Because there are criticisms of previous spatial strategies where it was something for everybody in the audience. We're trying to move away from that to do something maybe different. There's the concept of regional cities. I buy into that personally, especially in the southeast. So it's very important in the context of infrastructure, because infrastructure will follow, hopefully, the National Planning Framework, a spatial strategy, and then that would make it easier for yourself to attract companies to other regions. So for someone who represents the southeast and sees that there is growth, there is positivity, but we're also still lagging behind, I see this as maybe as an opportunity for us in terms of the National Planning Framework. So how is the IDA going to interact with that strategy? And a second question will come to when you answer that, the last question.
So we see the National Planning Framework as...
1 minute left.
Yeah, I'll finish on that.
Deputy, we see the National Planning Framework as critical. I think it's hugely important. I think, to your point, it is important that decisions are made, that it isn't just diffuse and diverse, and that we're trying to develop everything again, because that, frankly, from an IDA perspective, that doesn't work. It is about developing centres of scale, critical mass, clusters, as I've said. That's what we've tried to do with within our own strategy. So you then need the infrastructure to support that. You mentioned the educational institutions and how they support that. It all comes together. We are heavily engaged with colleagues across government in relation to what our views and what we're seeing happening on the ground.
Perfect. And my final question is, because taxation was raised and corporation tax, and I'm not someone who's advocating that we increase corporation tax, but I just have a quick question for you based on a response you gave previously. Who sets the rate of corporation tax?
The government.
The government sets the rate of corporation tax, and we have revenue and we have other organisations who come before the Public Accounts Committee, and they'll have all sorts of opinions on issues in relation to revenue. And very often we'd ask the head of revenue for an opinion, and he will say, that's not a matter for me, that's a matter for government. So when the head of the IDA says that it should not be increased or decreased, that's a personal opinion. But it's not the role of the head of the IDA to set policy. It's a clear function of government. And obviously government and policy makers and politicians will decide whether or not we increase it or decrease it. And I say that by way of being helpful to yourself, because you may find yourself in a situation where there's a different government who might have a different opinion on all these matters, and it is the job of the head of the IDA, I take it, and maybe I'm wrong, it's your job to implement government policy. Would that be a fair
So Deputy, and apologies if I gave any other impression than my understanding that it is for government to set policy, but in response to Deputy Connolly, I think she asked me my view in relation to that, and I am obviously regularly asked my view on a lot of things, about lots of policies as to what would help in attracting foreign direct investment and what wouldn't. And I've given my response in relation to it. I mean, it is absolutely clear that it is for government and the Oireachtas to set policy positions on all of these things, but in a similar fashion to you've just asked me about what would help by way of supporting regional development from an infrastructure perspective, education and so on. I have given you a view. I have a similar view in relation to tax. That isn't to say that anybody, I'm not suggesting anybody might listen to it, Deputy, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't share it, I suspect.
Okay. Deputy Murphy, thanks.